At 06:17 hours local time, this Ukrainian forward observation post on the eastern edge of Kupiansk was shaking itself apart. Russian 152mm artillery had been pounding the district for 11 straight minutes. Concrete dust filled the basement where a squad of UA soldiers huddled against the walls, counting the seconds between impacts. But the shells weren't what froze the blood of the Ukrainian platoon commander staring at his tablet. It was the thermal feed from a reconnaissance drone circling 400 meters above the Oskil River crossing, showing not one, not two, but 3 Russian mechanized columns pushing west simultaneously. He could now fully make out the horde of BTR-82As, T-72B3 tanks, and infantry fighting vehicles stretching back nearly a kilometer into the gray dawn. What the commander was seeing on that screen meant one thing. By every rule of modern warfare, his unit was already done for. The Russians weren't probing anymore. They were coming to fully take the city. What unfolded next would turn a near-certain Ukrainian collapse into one of the most devastating tactical reversals of the entire Kharkiv front. A deliberate retreat that became a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, executed with a level of precision that Russian commanders never saw coming. But first, the Ukrainians had to survive the next few minutes. The observation post's wall shuddered again. Plaster rained from the ceiling. The radio crackled with a panicked voice. Russian infantry dismounting 800 meters east, moving through the tree lines towards Zapadna. The platoon commander made a decision that, on paper, looked like surrender. He ordered his men to fall back. For weeks, Russian forces had been tightening the knot around Kupiansk. Ukrainian defensive lines had bent, then bent further, and Western military analysts were already drafting assessments suggesting the city's fall was imminent, and the Russians knew it. Intelligence intercepts confirmed what Ukrainian commanders suspected. Russian battalion tactical groups had been told Kupiansk was functionally captured, that Ukrainian resistance had collapsed to scattered pockets, and the final push would be little more than a mopping-up operation. What they didn't know, and wouldn't realize until it was far too late, was that every kilometer they advanced pushed any prospect of a retreat closer to impossible. But the Ukrainians had a more immediate problem. Those 3 advancing columns weren't just pushing toward the city center. They were converging on a single axis, the main eastern highway corridor that ran straight through Kupiansk's eastern districts. If those columns linked up, they'd have a direct armored highway into the city's heart. Ukrainian forces would be cut off, surrounded, and captured, or worse. But the Ukrainian platoon commander's tactical retreat wasn't panic. It was bait. As his squad pulled back through pre-planned routes, basements, drainage culverts, and shattered apartment blocks, they left behind something the Russians couldn't see: a network of concealed observation posts, each one feeding real-time coordinates to Ukrainian artillery batteries positioned a few kilometers west. The trap was set, but the Russians were moving faster than expected. At 06:31, the lead elements of the first Russian column crossed the initial phase line, a bombed-out intersection that Ukrainian forces had abandoned earlier that morning. None of them noticed the Ukrainian drones circling overhead, marking every vehicle, every dismount point, every command vehicle antenna. And the Russians' hubris blinded them to the second threat closing in behind them. Their supply convoy had entered the same eastern corridor, fuel trucks, ammo carriers, medics rolling nose to tail right out in the open. If Ukrainian guns fired now, they'd shred the entire logistics tail. If they waited, the armor would disappear into Kupiansk's streets, beyond artillery reach, without flattening friendly positions. The window wasn't narrowing, it was collapsing. But it wasn't that simple. To the west, Ukrainian artillery commanders stared at an impossible decision. They had the coordinates, they had the shells, but firing meant lighting up Zoopark 1M radars, inviting instant counter-battery fire, and Ukrainian infantry could be caught under their own barrage. And if they struck too soon, the Russian columns might scatter before the trap was sealed. But if they wait, Kupiansk falls. Meanwhile, the retreating Ukrainian infantry had their own crisis. The deliberate withdrawal was working. Russian forces were flooding into the eastern corridors exactly as planned. But the speed of the advance meant Ukrainian squads were now dangerously close to the engagement zones they'd helped create. The platoon commander clocked his watch, checked his radio, and looked at the drone feed one more time. The lead Russian BTR was 200 meters from the designated impact zone. His rearmost fire team was 380 meters from the same grid square. He keyed his radio urgently, knowing the next words might be putting his own men in danger. All units, phase line Bravo, execute now. The Ukrainian countermaneuver wasn't a single strike. It was a synchronized system designed to collapse Russian momentum from multiple directions simultaneously. The first line to execute the order was the Ukrainian 2 S7 Pion self-propelled guns. These 203mm monsters were capable of hurling 110-kilogram shells over 37 kilometers. Time to let it rip. The two S7s opened fire from concealed positions near Shevchenkove. Each round carried enough explosive force to flip a truck. Suddenly, like lightning, Ukraine's artillery hellfire began dropping in behind the Russian advances, and within 60 seconds, 3 critical intersections east of Kupiansk were cratered and burning. Russian logistics vehicles that had been following the assault columns found themselves cut off. See, the Pions weren't aiming at the armored columns directly. They were targeting the roads behind them, attacking the supply routes, fuel trucks, ammo carriers, and command vehicles. If Russian leaders' comms capabilities lasted just another minute or two, the entire Ukrainian countermaneuver would collapse into a disorganized firefight they couldn't win. Then, as roadways were still being turned to rubble, Ukrainian vampire drone swarms materialized from nowhere. These small FPV units equipped with anti-armor munitions had been pre-positioned in buildings along the Eastern Highway corridor. Russia had rolled right into the lion's den. Just like the artillery fire, the FPV operators weren't targeting tanks. They were targeting command vehicles, the BTR-80Ks with their distinctive antenna arrays. These were the very vehicles responsible for transmitting comms to coordinate the Russian assault. If they could shut down command, the columns would collapse into disarray. If they missed, Russian officers would adapt, regroup, and push through with local initiative. Away from the action, a hidden Ukrainian flanking force made their move. They'd been holding positions north of Kupiansk for days, invisible to Russian reconnaissance. As the artillery cratering continued and the drone strikes orchestrated additional chaos in the Russian columns, the flanking force pushed south, not toward the city, but toward the Oskil River crossing the Russians had used to enter the engagement zone. It had suddenly dawned on Russian command that the city they were hoping to capture was now swallowing them whole. At 0647, the Russian assault began to unravel. Their lead company had pushed 1.2 kilometers into Kupiansk's eastern districts when their battalion commander's vehicle exploded. An FPV drone had punched through the BTR-80K's top armor, detonating inside the crew compartment just after they had abandoned it. Russian command no longer had comms to their operation. Standard Russian doctrine called for immediate consolidation. Pull back to the last secured position, establish a defensive perimeter, wait for reinforcement. But the roads behind them were burning. Artillery was still falling on the intersections they'd crossed minutes earlier. They couldn't go forward, they couldn't go back, but the trap wasn't sealed yet. At 0649, a Russian tank platoon commander in the second column made a decision that nearly saved his unit. Instead of pushing deeper into the jaws of the ambush, he ordered his 4 T-72B3s to reverse, back toward the Oskil crossing, back toward safety. The flanking force was still 600 meters from the bridge. If those tanks reached the crossing first, they'd establish a defensive position that could hold for hours. Reinforcements would pour across. The pocket would become a bridgehead. Everything the Ukrainians had sacrificed would mean nothing. At 0651, Ukrainian artillery shifted fire. Shells that had been cratering supply routes now walked toward the retreating armor. 1 T-72 took a near miss that shredded its external fuel tanks. The crew bailed as flames engulfed the engine deck. 3 tanks left, 400 meters to the bridge. For the Ukrainian flanking force's lead element, a single BMP-2 with a squad of infantry, the loss of the bridge would mean game over. The vehicle commander ordered maximum speed, knowing Russian tank guns could strike them at twice this distance. At 0652, the BMP-2 reached the western bank. Infantry poured out and sprinted for cover as the first T-72 crested the rise 350 meters east. The Russian gunner traversed his turret. The Ukrainians had one Stugna-P missile. One shot. Boom! The Russians' turret separated from the hull in a column of fire. 2 other tanks stopped. They couldn't advance into a defended position. They couldn't retreat through burning roads. By 0654, the UA's flanking force had established firing positions on the western bank. Any Russian vehicle attempting to cross would face anti-tank missiles, drone strikes, and concentrated fire. The trap had closed. Inside Kupiansk, the chaos multiplied. Russian infantry who had dismounted to clear buildings found themselves ambushed by Ukrainian troops who had never actually left. The urban terrain that was supposed to favor the attackers became a maze of coordinated waylays. At 0703, Russian command finally got through to supporting artillery, but it was futile. Ukrainian electronic warfare units had been jamming Russian communications since the counteroffensive began. Fire missions were delayed, coordinates were garbled, and several Russian shells landed dangerously close to their own infantry. Russian command looked on to see that the assault wasn't just stalling, it was over. By 0738, the scale of the Russian disaster became undeniable. Russian tanks and vehicles sat burning along the corridor, their aluminum armor no match for the concentrated drone strikes. 3 T-72B3 tanks had been destroyed, one with its turret blown completely off. Another was abandoned by its crew in the chaos. The third was burning at the Oskil crossing, where it had tried to force over the bridge. Russian infantry began surrendering in small groups, emerging from buildings with hands raised, preferring Ukrainian captivity to the chaos consuming their units. By 0815, Russian commanders had lost contact with over 60% of the forces they'd committed to the Kupiansk assault. The battle for Kupiansk isn't over. Russian forces still held positions east of the city, and the pressure on Ukrainian defensive lines will likely continue. But the December counteroffensive had shattered something more important than a single assault column. It had shattered the assumption of inevitable Russian victory. For the soldiers of the 14th Separate Mechanized Brigade who had retreated through Kupiansk's shattered streets that morning, the victory was personal. They had bet their lives on a plan that required running toward their own artillery. They had trusted commanders who asked them to look like they were losing. The city still stood, and so did they. Stay prepared, stay informed, subscribe for more.